The rain had been falling over Richmond for nearly an hour when Malcolm Reed stepped out of the black sedan and pulled the collar of his charcoal overcoat against the cold. He looked like an ordinary businessman returning home late, quiet, composed, carrying a leather briefcase in one hand. Nothing about him suggested that he was one of the most powerful intelligence officials in the United States. He didn't flash a badge. He didn't demand respect. He simply closed the car door and started walking toward the courthouse parking lot. Then red and blue lights suddenly flooded the wet pavement. A police cruiser stopped behind him. Officer Jonathan Pierce stepped out, one hand resting on his duty belt, his expression already hardened. "Stop right there." Malcolm stopped. He slowly turned around. "Good evening, officer." Pierce walked toward him, looking him up and down. His eyes lingered on Malcolm's coat, his briefcase, then his face. "What are you doing here?" "I'm leaving," Malcolm answered calmly. "Show me some identification." Malcolm reached inside his coat. Pierce immediately raised his voice. Slowly, Malcolm paused, then handed him a government identification card. Pierce barely glanced at it before tossing it back against Malcolm's chest. "This doesn't tell me anything." Malcolm looked down at the card, then back at the officer. "It tells you exactly what you need to know." Pierce smirked. "Don't get smart with me." The rain intensified, tapping against Malcolm's shoulders and shining across the pavement beneath the streetlights. A second officer remained inside the cruiser, watching through the windshield. Malcolm could have ended the encounter with one phone call. He could have revealed his position, his authority, his name. But he didn't. Instead, he quietly asked, "Am I being detained?" Pierce stepped closer. "You are now." Malcolm's expression barely changed. "Why?" "Suspicious activity." "What activity?" Pierce's jaw tightened. "You were standing around a government building after hours." Malcolm glanced toward the courthouse. "I was walking to my vehicle." "Turn around." Malcolm didn't move. "Officer, I have done nothing wrong." Pierce's face hardened. "I said turn around." For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Pierce grabbed Malcolm's arm and forced it behind his back. The briefcase slipped from Malcolm's hand and landed on the wet pavement. Papers scattered across the ground. Pierce snapped the handcuffs around his wrists. Click. The sound seemed strangely loud beneath the rain. Malcolm lowered his eyes to the scattered documents. Then he looked at the officer. "You should reconsider what you're doing." Pierce laughed. "You people always say that after you get caught." Malcolm's eyes became still. Not angry, not frightened, just watchful. Pierce pulled him toward the cruiser. "You're going to jail." Malcolm walked without resisting. But before he entered the back seat, he glanced at the clock on the courthouse wall. 11:17 p.m. He quietly whispered 4 words that Pierce couldn't understand. "You have until midnight." Then the cruiser door slammed shut, and Jonathan Pierce had no idea that he had just arrested the wrong man. The cruiser rolled through the rain-soaked streets toward the precinct, its red and blue lights reflecting across the windows like warning signals Malcolm Reed had seen countless times before. He sat in the back seat with his hands cuffed behind him, his charcoal overcoat still damp from the rain, his face calm as the city blurred beyond the glass. Jonathan Pierce kept glancing at him through the rearview mirror. There was something about Malcolm's silence that irritated him. Most people in the back of a police cruiser pleaded, argued, or demanded a lawyer. Malcolm did none of those things. He simply watched the rain slide down the window. "You planning on staying quiet all night?" Pierce asked. Malcolm looked at his reflection in the glass.
"I'm listening."
Pierce gave a short laugh. "Good. Then listen carefully. You're going to answer every question I ask." Malcolm turned his eyes toward him. "That's not how this works." The smile disappeared from Pierce's face. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Malcolm said nothing. A few minutes later, the cruiser pulled into the station. The garage door opened with a metallic groan, and harsh fluorescent lights spilled. Across the wet pavement, Pierce opened the rear door and grabbed Malcolm by the arm. "Out." Malcolm stepped onto the concrete. Inside, several officers looked up. Their conversations faded as Pierce marched Malcolm across the station floor. The sight of a black man in an expensive overcoat, his hands locked behind his back, immediately drew attention. One officer whispered something to another. A few eyes followed Malcolm with the familiar curiosity reserved for someone already presumed guilty. Pierce seemed to enjoy it. "Got yourself another problem, Jonathan?" Sergeant Brandon Keller called from behind the front desk. Pierce smirked. "Found him lurking outside the courthouse." Keller looked Malcolm over. "What was he doing?" "Wouldn't explain." Malcolm calmly corrected him. "I explained exactly what I was doing." Pierce's expression hardened. "See? That's what I'm talking about." Keller chuckled. "Take him to processing." Malcolm stopped. "I'd like to make a phone call." Pierce stepped closer. "You'll make one when I say you can." Malcolm looked directly into his eyes. "Officer Pierce, I am asking you to follow proper procedure." Pierce leaned in until his voice became low. "You don't give me orders." Then he pushed Malcolm toward the hallway. The handcuffs tightened against Malcolm's wrists as he walked. His briefcase was carried separately by another officer. He noticed something on the desk as he passed. A wall clock. 11:29 p.m. His eyes lingered on it for half a second. Pierce noticed. "What are you looking at?" "The time." "Why?" Malcolm looked back at him. "No reason." They entered a small processing room. Cold walls, a metal chair, a camera mounted high in the corner. Pierce removed Malcolm's wallet and placed it on the table. Then he picked up the identification card again. This time he stared at it longer. Something about the card bothered him. The seal was unfamiliar. The identification number was unlike anything he had seen before. "What agency is this?" Pierce asked. Malcolm remained silent. Pierce slammed the card onto the table. "I asked you a question." Malcolm finally looked up. His voice remained almost impossibly calm. "And I think you already know you shouldn't be asking it." For the first time that night, Jonathan Pierce stopped smiling. He didn't know why. He only knew that the room suddenly felt colder. And across the station, the clock continued moving toward midnight. The processing room seemed to grow smaller with every passing second. Malcolm Reed sat perfectly still in the metal chair, his charcoal overcoat draped across his shoulders, while Jonathan Pierce stood on the other side of the table, turning Malcolm's identification card between his fingers. The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow across the room. A camera watched from the upper corner, its small red indicator blinking steadily. Malcolm noticed it immediately. Pierce noticed Malcolm noticing it. "You keep looking at that camera," Pierce said. "Is there something you want to say?" Malcolm looked back at him. "No." Pierce leaned against the table. "Then stop acting like you know more than everyone in this building." Malcolm's expression remained calm. "I haven't said anything." "Exactly," Pierce snapped. "You sit there like you're above this." Malcolm looked down at the cuffs around his wrists. "I'm simply waiting for you to follow procedure." Pierce laughed under his breath. "Procedure?" He pulled a chair across from Malcolm and sat down. "You want procedure? Fine. Let's start with your name." "Malcolm Reed." Pierce wrote it on a form.
Occupation.
Malcolm paused for a moment. "Federal government." Pierce looked up. "That's vague." "It's accurate." Pierce's pen stopped. "What agency?" Malcolm didn't answer. Pierce leaned forward. "Taya." The room became silent. Malcolm simply looked at him. That silence was enough to make Pierce smile again. "Thought so," he said. "You people always think throwing around a government agency is going to scare somebody." Malcolm's eyes narrowed slightly. "You asked me a question. I didn't confirm anything." Pierce pushed the form aside. "Here's what I think happened. You were outside a restricted government facility after hours. You refused a lawful order. You resisted arrest. Now you're sitting here trying to intimidate me with some mysterious federal story." Malcolm slowly raised his eyes. "That's not what happened." "It is now." Those 3 words hung in the room. Malcolm studied him carefully. "Are you saying you're changing the report?" Pierce's jaw tightened. I'm saying the report will reflect what happened. Malcolm glanced toward the camera again. Pierce followed his gaze. Then he stood and walked over to it. You worried about the camera? He reached up and switched it off. The red light disappeared. For the first time, Malcolm's expression changed. Not fear, but disappointment. You shouldn't have done that. Pierce turned around. Why? Malcolm looked directly at him. Because now you have made this much worse. Pierce stepped closer. You don't scare me. Malcolm remained seated. I'm not trying to. Pierce grabbed the back of Malcolm's chair and pulled it slightly away from the table. You think you're special because you wear an expensive coat and carry a government card. Malcolm's voice remained quiet.
No.
I think you made a mistake. Pierce smiled. Everyone says that. He opened a folder and began writing. Suspicious behavior. Failure to comply. Verbal resistance. Malcolm watched the words appear on the page. He knew exactly what Pierce was doing. He wasn't documenting an arrest. He was constructing a story. And somewhere beyond those walls, the truth was already moving faster than the paperwork. Malcolm looked once more at the wall clock. 11:41 p.m. 20 minutes had passed since he entered the station. He lowered his eyes and said nothing. Pierce mistook the silence for surrender. That was his second mistake. Because Malcolm Reed wasn't sitting there trying to figure out how to escape. He was waiting to see how far Jonathan Pierce was willing to go when he believed nobody powerful was watching. And the answer was beginning to become very clear. At 11:43 p.m., the station had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Phones rang behind the front desk. Printers hummed. Officers moved through the hallway carrying folders and paper cups of coffee, pretending nothing unusual was happening. But inside the processing room, Jonathan Pierce was becoming more confident by the minute. He had already written most of his report. In his version, Malcolm Reed was suspicious, uncooperative, and potentially dangerous. Every fact that didn't fit had quietly disappeared. Malcolm watched without interrupting. Then Pierce pushed the paperwork across the table. Sign it. Malcolm looked down at the report. He read every line. This isn't accurate. Pierce folded his arms. It's your statement. No, Malcolm said calmly. It's yours. Pierce's face tightened. Sign it. Malcolm pushed the paper back. I won't sign something I know is false. Pierce stared at him for several seconds, then snatched the document from the table. Fine. We'll do this the hard way. He walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned around. Enjoy the cell. The door slammed shut. Malcolm remained alone. But he wasn't completely alone. A small green light appeared on the camera above him. It had been switched back on. Malcolm looked directly at it. He said nothing. Outside, Officer Daniel Price stood behind the observation window, watching the room. He was younger than Pierce, perhaps 30, with only a few years on the force. He had witnessed the arrest from the beginning, and something about it had never felt right. He looked down at his tablet and replayed the initial footage. Malcolm had not resisted. He had not raised his voice. He had not even stepped toward Pierce. Yet the report described him as aggressive. Daniel frowned. He rewound the footage. Again, Malcolm standing in the rain. Pierce approaching. Malcolm presenting identification. Pierce grabbing him. Daniel paused the video. Then he noticed something. Malcolm had looked directly at the patrol car's dashboard camera before Pierce even touched him. Why? Daniel continued watching. He saw Malcolm's briefcase fall. Papers scattered across the pavement. One document had landed face up for less than 2 seconds before the rain covered it. Daniel zoomed in. There was a seal at the top. He couldn't read the entire title, but he recognized the design. It wasn't local. It wasn't state. It looked federal. Daniel's stomach tightened. He turned toward Sergeant Brandon Keller. Sergeant. Keller looked up from his desk. What? Do we have authorization for this arrest? Keller barely glanced over. Pierce handled it. That's not what I asked. Keller's eyes narrowed. Are you questioning another officer's arrest? Daniel hesitated. I'm asking because the identification he presented looked federal. Keller's expression changed for just a moment. Then it disappeared. Forget it. Daniel stared at him. Why? Keller lowered his voice. Because you don't want to involve yourself in something you don't understand. Daniel looked through the glass toward Malcolm. The man was still sitting perfectly still. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't banging on the door. He wasn't even looking toward the hallway. He was simply waiting. Daniel suddenly wondered what Malcolm was waiting for. Then he noticed the wall clock. 11:47 p.m. 14 minutes before midnight. Across the station, Jonathan Pierce walked toward the evidence room carrying Malcolm's briefcase. He opened it and began searching through the contents. A notebook, pen, several sealed documents. Nothing that looked immediately useful. Then his fingers touched something beneath the inner lining. A second phone. Pierce pulled it out. The screen was locked. He smiled. Got you. But the moment he touched the device, the screen illuminated by itself. One sentence appeared in white letters against a black background. Operation Nightfall. Authorized personnel only. Pierce's smile vanished. And behind the observation glass, Daniel Price realized something terrifying. Malcolm Reed had never been trying to escape the station. He had been waiting for them to reveal themselves. The words on the phone screen remained unchanged. Operation Nightfall. Authorized personnel only. Jonathan Pierce stared at them, his fingers frozen above the device. For the first time that night, the confidence in his face disappeared. He looked toward the evidence room door, then back at the phone. What the hell is this? He whispered. The screen went black. Pierce pressed the power button. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. Then, without warning, the phone vibrated once in his hand. A single message appeared. Do not access this device. Pierce immediately dropped it onto the evidence table as if it had burned him. Across the station, Malcolm Reed remained seated in the processing room. His hands were still cuffed behind his back. His overcoat was still damp. His expression was still unreadable. But his eyes moved toward the wall clock. 11:49 p.m. 11 minutes. That was all. Sergeant Brandon Keller entered the evidence room and saw Pierce standing over the phone. What did you find? Pierce turned. This was inside his briefcase. Keller stepped closer. He recognized the phone immediately as something far more sophisticated than an ordinary government device. Did you open it? It opened itself. Keller's face tightened. What did you see? Pierce hesitated. Operation Nightfall. The color drained slightly from Keller's face. Put it back. Why? Because I said so. Pierce stared at him. You know what this is? Keller looked toward the hallway before answering. I know enough to tell you that this isn't something we touch. Pierce picked up the phone again. Then why was he carrying it? Keller didn't answer. That silence bothered Pierce more than the message on the screen. He had spent years believing that every situation had a simple hierarchy. He had the badge. Keller had rank. Everyone else followed orders. But now there was something in the room that neither of them understood. Keller finally lowered his voice. Take his identification to my office. Pierce nodded and grabbed the card. As he turned, Daniel Price appeared in the doorway. Sergeant. Keller immediately stiffened. What? Daniel held out his tablet. I reviewed the arrest footage. Pierce scoffed. And? The report doesn't match the video. Silence. Keller stared at him. What exactly doesn't match? Daniel swallowed. Malcolm Reed never resisted. He never threatened Pierce. He never raised his voice. He asked whether he was being detained, and Pierce arrested him anyway. Pierce stepped forward. Watch your accusations. Daniel didn't move. I'm not accusing anyone. I'm describing what the camera shows. Keller took the tablet from him and watched the footage. His face became increasingly serious. Then Daniel pointed to the moment Malcolm presented his identification. Zoom in. Keller did. The identification card filled the screen. A federal seal appeared clearly for the first time. Underneath it was a designation Daniel didn't recognize. Keller did. His eyes widened. Where did you get this? Daniel answered. From the footage. Keller immediately shut off the tablet. Nobody else sees this. Daniel stared at him. Why? Keller's voice became colder. Because I told you. Inside the processing room, Malcolm heard footsteps approaching. The door opened. Pierce entered with a different expression now. The arrogance was still there, but something underneath it had changed. He placed Malcolm's identification card on the table. Who are you? Malcolm looked at the card, then at Pierce. You've already asked me that. I'm asking again. Malcolm remained silent. Pierce leaned over the table. What is Operation Nightfall? Malcolm slowly lifted his eyes. For the first time, there was the faintest trace of a smile on his face. You shouldn't have found that. Pierce's breathing changed. So it is real? Malcolm said nothing. Pierce slammed his palm against the table. Answer me. Malcolm didn't flinch. He simply looked toward the wall clock. 11:53 p.m. 7 minutes. Then Malcolm quietly said, You're running out of time. Pierce stepped back. Time for what? Malcolm looked directly into his eyes. For you to decide whether you're going to keep making mistakes. Outside the room, Daniel Price stood frozen. He had just received an alert on his computer. The message contained no explanation, only a timestamp and 3 words. Federal response initiated. Daniel looked at the clock. 11:54 p.m. 7 minutes later, the station would no longer belong to Jonathan Pierce. He just didn't know it yet. The clock on the station wall showed 11:54 p.m. 5 minutes remained. Jonathan Pierce stood in the processing room staring at Malcolm Reed. But the confidence that had carried him through the night was beginning to crack. What happens at midnight? He demanded. Malcolm said nothing. Pierce stepped closer. You think somebody is coming for you? Malcolm's eyes remained fixed on him.
No, Pierce frowned.
Then why do you keep looking at that clock? Malcolm finally answered. Because time matters. Pierce scoffed, but the sound lacked its earlier certainty. He grabbed the back of Malcolm's chair and pulled it closer. Listen to me. Whatever game you're playing ends here. Malcolm calmly looked at the handcuffs around his wrists. You ended it when you turned off the camera. Pierce froze. What? You heard me. Malcolm's voice was quiet. You thought turning off the camera would remove the evidence. Pierce's face tightened. There is no evidence. Malcolm looked toward the corner of the room. The camera's red light was glowing again. Are you sure? Pierce turned sharply. He had forgotten that Daniel Price had restored the feed. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Then Pierce's radio suddenly crackled. Unit 12. Respond to front entrance. He reached for it. What's happening? Static answered. Then another voice came through. Multiple black SUVs approaching the station. Pierce looked toward the hallway. How many? I count 6. Malcolm lowered his eyes. 11:56 p.m. Pierce looked back at him. Who are you? Malcolm didn't answer. Outside, the station began to change. Officers moved toward the front windows. Brandon Keller stepped out of his office and looked through the blinds. 6 dark SUVs had stopped across the street. Their headlights remained off. Their engines continued running.
No sirens. No flashing lights.
Just silence. Keller felt a cold pressure settle in his chest. He turned toward Daniel. Lock the front doors. Daniel hesitated. Why? Keller's voice became sharp. Just do it. Daniel didn't move. Sergeant, we have no reason to lock down the station. Keller stared at him. That's an order. Daniel looked through the glass doors again. One of the SUV doors opened. A woman in a dark federal coat stepped onto the sidewalk. Lauren Mitchell. She held a sealed folder in one hand. 2 agents followed behind her. Keller's face went pale. Everyone stay at your desks, he ordered. But nobody moved. Inside the processing room, Malcolm heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Pierce looked at him again. You know them. Malcolm remained silent. You know exactly who they are. Malcolm finally lifted his eyes. Yes. Pierce's breathing became heavier. Are they here for you? Malcolm paused. No, Pierce stared at him. Then who are they here for? Malcolm looked at the clock. 11:58 p.m. You'll know soon. Pierce stepped backward. The arrogance was gone now. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, every radio inside the station suddenly erupted with the same voice. Federal agents at the entrance. Do not interfere. Then the front doors opened. Lauren Mitchell walked inside. She didn't shout. She didn't draw a weapon. She simply looked across the station as if she already knew exactly where everything was. Her eyes moved from the officers to Brandon Keller, then toward the processing hallway. Jonathan Pierce stepped out of the room. Lauren looked directly at him. Officer Pierce? He swallowed. Yes. She held up the sealed folder. Step away from the prisoner. Pierce glanced toward Malcolm. He's under arrest. Lauren's expression didn't change. That arrest is no longer recognized. Pierce stared at her. On whose authority? Lauren looked at the clock. 11:59 p.m. Then she turned toward the processing room. You won't have to wait long. Malcolm stood slowly. The room fell silent. 1 minute remained. And when the clock struck midnight, Jonathan Pierce would finally learn why Malcolm Reed had never once looked afraid. Midnight struck. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then every light in the station seemed unnaturally bright. Lauren Mitchell stepped farther into the building, followed by 4 federal agents carrying sealed cases. The officers behind the desk stopped talking. Phones stopped ringing. Even the printer seemed to fall silent. Jonathan Pierce stood in the middle of the hallway, staring at Lauren. You can't just walk into a police station and take someone, he said, trying to recover the authority in his voice. Lauren looked at him without blinking. I'm not taking anyone. She turned toward the processing room. I'm retrieving the director. Pierce's face tightened. The director of what? Lauren didn't answer. She simply walked past him. Brandon Keller stepped forward. Agent Mitchell, perhaps we can discuss this privately. Lauren stopped.
No que ayer swallowed.
You don't understand the situation. Lauren slowly turned toward him. I understand it perfectly. She opened the sealed folder in her hand. At 11:17 p.m., Officer Jonathan Pierce detained a federal official without probable cause. At 11:24, he fabricated portions of the arrest report. At 11:31, Sergeant Brandon Keller instructed another officer to conceal federal identification. At 11:47, an unauthorized attempt was made to access a classified government device. The station became completely silent. Pierce stared at her. That's impossible. Lauren looked at him. Is it? Then the processing room door opened. Malcolm Reed stepped into the hallway. His charcoal overcoat was still damp. His hands were still cuffed behind his back. He looked exactly as he had when Pierce first dragged him through the station. Calm, composed, almost detached from the chaos surrounding him. Pierce looked at him and shook his head. Who are you? Malcolm didn't answer immediately. Lauren approached him and stopped a few feet away. Sir. Malcolm gave a slight nod. Lauren looked at Pierce. Officer, you asked who he was. She paused. You should have asked before putting him in handcuffs. Pierce's eyes moved between them. He's some federal employee. Lauren's expression remained cold. No, she reached into her coat and removed an official credential. Malcolm Reed is the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. The words landed like a thunderclap. Nobody moved. Daniel Price's mouth fell slightly open. Brandon Keller stared at Malcolm as if he had suddenly become a stranger. Pierce simply stood there. The man he had mocked. The man he had accused of suspicious activity. The man whose identification he had tossed across a table. The man he had told was going to jail. The CIA director. Malcolm looked around the station. His eyes settled briefly on Daniel, then on Keller, and finally on Pierce. He didn't look angry. That somehow made the moment worse. Lauren stepped forward and unlocked Malcolm's handcuffs. The metal clicked open. Malcolm rubbed his wrists once, then handed the cuffs back to her. Pierce finally found his voice. Sir, I didn't know. Malcolm looked at him. That's the problem. Pierce shook his head. If I'd known who you were, Malcolm interrupted quietly, you would have treated me differently. Pierce fell silent. Malcolm's gaze remained steady. And that's exactly why I didn't tell you. Lauren closed the folder. Director Reed entered the station tonight under an authorized covert identity as part of Operation Nightfall. A murmur moved through the officers. Malcolm turned toward the evidence room. You were never supposed to know I was here. He looked at Pierce. But you showed us something we needed to see. Pierce's face went pale. What? Malcolm answered with a calmness that cut deeper than anger. What happens when you believe nobody important is watching? He glanced toward the cameras, the reports, the evidence room, and the officers standing frozen around him. Now we know. Behind Malcolm, the federal agents began placing evidence seals across the doors. The station was no longer an ordinary police station. It was now a federal crime scene. And Jonathan Pierce finally understood that his arrest of Malcolm Reed had not been the beginning of Malcolm's downfall. It had been the evidence that would bring everyone else down with him. Within minutes, the entire station had been transformed. Federal agents moved through the halls with quiet precision, placing bright evidence seals across doors, computer terminals, filing cabinets, and storage rooms. No one shouted. No one needed to. The silence itself carried more authority than any command. Jonathan Pierce stood near the processing room, watching agents remove the computer he had used only an hour earlier to write Malcolm Reed's arrest report. His face had lost all color. You can't seize department property without a warrant, he muttered. Lauren Mitchell didn't even look at him. We have authorization. She handed a sealed document to Brandon Keller. He read the first page, then stopped. His hands began to tremble. This is a federal seizure order. Lauren finally looked at him. Correct. Keller lowered the document. What exactly are you investigating? Malcolm Reed stepped into the hallway behind her. His overcoat was still damp, but his posture remained straight. Not what? Malcolm said quietly. Who? Keller looked at him. Director Reed. I can explain. Malcolm shook his head. That's the problem with explanations. They usually arrive after the evidence. 2 agents entered the evidence room carrying Pierce's body camera and Malcolm's briefcase. Another agent placed a sealed bag on the table containing the encrypted phone Pierce had discovered. Lauren opened a second folder. We have records of altered arrest reports, missing complaint files, deleted footage, unauthorized evidence transfers. She looked toward Pierce. And tonight we have a live example. Pierce's eyes widened. I didn't delete anything. Daniel Price stepped forward. His voice was quiet but firm. The camera footage shows you turned off the processing room camera at 11:41. Pierce looked at him. You recorded that? Daniel nodded. The backup system did. Pierce's jaw tightened. He looked toward Keller for support. Keller didn't meet his eyes. That was when Malcolm understood something important. Fear had already begun separating the people who had protected each other. He walked toward the evidence table and stopped beside the files. Lauren handed him a folder. Malcolm opened it. Inside were complaint forms from years of previous incidents. Different names, different dates, different neighborhoods. But the same pattern appeared again and again. Black men stopped without explanation. Black women searched without cause. Reports rewritten after the fact. Complaints closed without meaningful investigation. Malcolm turned one page after another. His expression hardened slightly. How many? Lauren answered. 37 confirmed cases. More are still being reviewed. Daniel looked stunned. 37. Malcolm closed the folder. And how many never made it into the system? Nobody answered. Malcolm looked toward Pierce. You thought tonight was about one arrest. Pierce swallowed. It was a mistake. Malcolm's eyes remained fixed on him. No. The mistake was believing you were entitled to make it. Lauren placed another file on the table. There is more. Malcolm opened it. This time, the documents connected Pierce and Keller to internal records that had been altered after complaints were filed. One signature appeared repeatedly. Brandon Keller's. Keller stepped backward. I was following department procedure. Malcolm looked at him. Procedure doesn't erase accountability. Around them, agents continued sealing the station. The front doors were locked. Officers were instructed to surrender their weapons temporarily. Every computer was being copied. Every report was being preserved. Every camera feed was secured. The same building where Malcolm had entered in handcuffs was now under federal control. Pierce watched as an agent placed a seal across the desk where he had laughed at Malcolm only hours earlier. He finally whispered, "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" Malcolm turned toward him. "Because if I had, you would have behaved differently." Pierce looked down. Malcolm continued, "I needed to know what you would do when you believed I had no power." He glanced around the sealed station. "Now we know." The last evidence seal was placed across the main evidence room door. Lauren stepped back. "Station secured." Malcolm nodded. Outside, rain continued falling over Richmond. Inside, the badge Pierce had trusted to protect him suddenly looked very small. And for the first time that night, he realized the worst consequence had nothing to do with Malcolm being the CIA director. It was that Malcolm had seen exactly who Jonathan Pierce was when he thought nobody important was watching. By sunrise, the rain had stopped, but the streets of Richmond were still covered in a thin layer of water that reflected the pale morning light. Inside the police station, the silence was unlike anything the officers had ever experienced. Every hallway had been sealed. Every computer had been secured. Every report connected to the investigation was now in federal custody. Jonathan Pierce sat alone in an interview room, staring at the badge he had been ordered to surrender. For years, that badge had been his shield. It had opened doors, ended arguments, and made people lower their voices when he entered a room. Now it sat inside a clear evidence bag on the table. Pierce looked at it for a long time. Then the door opened. Lauren Mitchell stepped inside carrying a folder. She placed it on the table but didn't sit down. "Your suspension is effective immediately," she said. Pierce swallowed. "Am I being charged?" "The investigation is ongoing." He looked toward her. "I didn't know who he was." Lauren's expression remained calm. "You keep saying that." Pierce lowered his eyes. "If I had known he was the CIA director, I never would have treated him that way." Lauren paused. "And that's exactly what Director Reed wants documented." Pierce looked up. "What does that mean?" Before Lauren could answer, the door opened again. Malcolm Reed walked into the room wearing the same charcoal overcoat he had worn the night before. The rain had dried from the fabric. His posture was calm, his expression unreadable. He didn't look like a man who had spent hours in handcuffs. He looked like a man who had simply finished a difficult assignment. Pierce stared at him. "Mr. Reed." Malcolm took the chair opposite him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Finally Pierce said, "I'm sorry." Malcolm looked at him. "For what?" Pierce hesitated. "For arresting you. For what I said. For the way I treated you." Malcolm's eyes remained steady. "Would you have apologized if you knew who I was?" Pierce couldn't answer. Malcolm nodded slightly. "That's what I thought." Pierce looked down at his hands. "I made a mistake." Malcolm leaned back. "No, Officer Pierce. You made a choice." The words landed heavily. "You had several opportunities to stop. When I showed identification. When I asked whether I was being detained. When you wrote the report. When you turned off the camera. When you found the phone. Every time you had a choice." Pierce's eyes began to redden. Malcolm continued, "My position didn't create your behavior. It revealed it." Silence filled the room. Outside, federal agents continued collecting evidence. Somewhere in the station, a printer began producing copies of old complaint records that had once been buried. Malcolm stood. "There are people whose names you never learned. People who walked out of this building believing nobody would ever listen to them." Pierce looked up. "What happens now?" Malcolm answered, "Now they get heard." He turned toward the door, then stopped. Pierce called after him, "Director Reed." Malcolm looked back. "Why did you let it go this far?" Malcolm's expression softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Because justice cannot depend on whether the victim has enough power to introduce himself. He opened the door. Lauren waited outside. Malcolm stepped into the hallway as morning light poured through the glass entrance. Behind him, the station remained sealed. Jonathan Pierce's badge was gone. Brandon Keller's records were under investigation. And the complaints of dozens of people who had once been ignored were finally being reopened. Malcolm paused at the entrance and looked back one final time. "A badge is supposed to protect the innocent," he said quietly. "The moment it becomes a weapon against them, accountability becomes the law." Then he walked into the morning. He had entered the station as a man in a dark overcoat whom nobody believed mattered. He left knowing the truth had finally spoken for everyone who had once been silenced. He thought the badge gave him power. But that night, the badge became the evidence.
Please like and subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of justice.